Funding for this program was provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by annual financial support from viewers like you. Tonight, Clive James concludes his look at the nature of fame in the 20th century as he examines the ever-changing face of fame. The word Watergate enters the language as the new Richard Nixon rises to power and falls.
I have concluded that because of the Watergate matter, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
Muhammad Ali proves he's still the greatest. The Hollywood leading man changes his image from the sensitive Tom Joad to the avengeful.
Shots are only 5.
America moves from presidents as performers to performers as presidents, as Ronald Reagan takes the helm. Western fame strikes an Eastern politician, Mikhail Gorbachev, and an English Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher. Sylvester Stallone slugs his way to stardom. Arnold Schwarzenegger builds himself up into an international icon. Charles and Di marry with a promise to live happily ever after, or so we thought. MTV rocks into our lives, and Madonna and Michael are everywhere. John Lennon, Yoko Ono, Saddam Hussein, and Woody Allen are just some members of the greatest cast ever assembled, appearing on the concluding episode of Clive James' Fame in the 20th Century.
In the quarter of the 20th century, since World War II, America's position as the world's dominant cultural power had grown beyond challenge. Could the Russians produce an Elvis Presley? Where was the Chinese Frank Sinatra? No, America decided who became famous, and the most famous American, the president, was the focus of the whole world's attention, the model of poise and dignity.
Now, turn your handle and let it go up. Turn your handle and let it go up. Now jerk it back.
I'll stay here and try to learn how to use the yo-yo. You'll go up and be president, bro.
Still painfully aware that Jack Kennedy's charm was not among his own attributes, Nixon admitted that he lacked charisma. He could have been less nervous about making the admission. Nixon's abilities were real. Kennedy had been famous for inviting Pablo Casals to play in the White House. But when Nixon invited Duke Ellington, Nixon could play the piano, which Kennedy had never actually been able to do.
Duke Ellington is ageless, but would you all stand and sing happy birthday to him, and please in the key of G.
He would never be entirely comfortable with the idea of a lot of people out there watching him, but a lot of people out there were as awkward as he was. They weren't glamour pusses either. Rolling Stone readers mightn't like him, but most people with a stake in the setup thought Nixon was at least competent. His notorious tricksiness turned into fame for being hard to fool. The heavy had become the leading man. The leading man took on a sidekick.
Ladies and gentlemen, today I am pleased to announce the first appointment of the White House staff in a major policy position. Dr. Henry Kissinger, professor of government at Harvard University.
Henry Kissinger was Nixon's roving troubleshooter on foreign policy. He had a foreign accent to match.
I believe very strongly that the position of a White House assistant is inconsistent with making public statements on substantive issues. Therefore, I hope you'll forgive me if I do not answer your question.
Kissinger never learned to speak like an American because he never listened. He was a bright man who always knew best. But he had one weakness. He simply loved being famous because it made glamorous women love him. Here was the century's clearest proof that fame really must be an aphrodisiac. With Kissinger to advise him, Nixon turned the world stage from a metaphor into a fact. He actually went to China instead of just sending messages. By being there, he identified American worldwide influence with himself. Go anywhere, do anything. America's tragic involvement in the Vietnam War looked like the only thing Nixon couldn't fix with a personal appearance. For young people at home and abroad, the war was his fault. Jane Fonda was a famous young film star from a family of film stars. She first came to prominence as a back-combed, mindless love object in Barbarella. But the film's director, Roger Vadim, not only married her, he helped introduce her to the world of ideas. One of the ideas was that a female film star should be something more than a sex symbol. Reborn as a politically aware person, Fonda was admired by all for trying to make intelligent films. She got a more mixed reception when she tried to make political points.
With very little means, they have managed, as they did many thousands of years ago against equally large and professional armies with perhaps less technology on their side, to withstand the U.S. military might. They do this by using their land, their trees, their animals, their bees, their minds, their imagination, their spirits, their love for each other. I think we have a great deal to learn from them.
Visiting Hanoi, she posed on an anti-aircraft gun otherwise employed to shoot down American bombers. Staking her fame on a point of principle made Fonda more famous than ever, but she came home with no guarantee that she would ever be allowed to star in films again. If Nixon had had his way, she wouldn't have. Behind the scenes, he set the tax authorities to harass famous enemies, while up front he was glad-handing his famous friends, who glad-handed him right back. And when he wasn't playing host in the White House, he was the guest of honor in the Kremlin. Somewhere back there in the Kremlin garage, Brezhnev had a secret collection of American cars. Nixon wasn't collecting Russian ones. He was there to prove he had the moral edge, the historic stature. Nixon was making even the East look like part of the Western world. The diplomatic chess match between the US and the USSR included chess itself when the Americans fielded Bobby Fischer against the Russian champion Boris Spassky. Fischer was even more famous for erratic behavior than Spassky. Spassky merely believed that the CIA was poisoning his yogurt and trying to psych him out with gamma rays. Fischer kicked Spassky under the table. Fischer won the actual tournament, but Spassky came out ahead in the sympathy stakes. The Americans were turning out screwballs. The Soviets had a huge PR success with their prepubescent champion gymnast, Olga Korbut. Little Olga could do everything Americans had ever done. She was as precocious as Shirley Temple, no bigger than Mickey Mouse. She flew through the air like Superman, and she could smile while she danced like Dick Van Dyke.
Oh, that was terrific! Isn't she marvelous? Olga Korbut has caused so many sensations here this evening, it just isn't true. And she's done it! She's done it! 9.9. Olga Korbut wins the gold.
The Russians were turning out prodigies. The Russians turned out Solzhenitsyn altogether. He was too famous for the KGB to kill, so they booked him on a long flight by Aeroflot as the next best thing. He arrived in the West to continue telling his story of the Soviet Union's long-standing reign of terror against its own people. The Americans were glad to hear this, but less enthusiastic about his other message. He said that the communist threat would be victorious unless democracy could unite in a crusade for moral purity. But democracy's top man was suddenly looking less pure. All the media attention that made it look as if Mr. Fix wasn't so bad after all couldn't be turned off when the Watergate scandal broke. For young idealists everywhere, Watergate was heaven sent. The villain who had been threatening to turn into a tough guy hero was back to being a villain again.
People have got to know whether or not their president is a crook. Well, I'm not a crook.
He went on denying the undeniable until he had so little credibility left that it sounded like a cover-up even when he resigned.
I have concluded that because of the Watergate matter, I might not have the support of the Congress that I would consider necessary to back the very difficult decisions and carry out the duties of this office in the way the interests of the nation will require. Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
Nixon had got to the point where you couldn't believe anything he said, even when he was just saying goodbye.
We leave with high hopes, in good spirit, and with deep humility.
He brought fame itself into doubt. A world of skeptics had been created, who from now on would always wonder about the real story behind the aura. The sneaking suspicion that Mother Teresa might really be after a recording contract started with Nixon. The Godfather was made while Nixon was still in the White House. All of Marlon Brando's old fame plus a slice more returned when he played Don Corleone as a presidential head mobster.
If you'd come to me in friendship, then the scum that ruined your daughter would be suffering this very day. And if by chance an honest man like yourself should make enemies, then he would become my enemies. And then they would fear you.
After Watergate, The Godfather acquired an extra nostalgia appeal as a portrait of a presidential head mobster who knew what was going on, did not screw up, and would have been able to burgle Democratic Party headquarters without getting caught.
Good.
Brando still had stature. He had too much stature. The new disillusioned age called for anti-heroes. Jack Nicholson was eager to respond. In One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, Nicholson was supposed to be a madman, but he was a sane madman. It was the system that was insane. The only hope was to live by your own rules.
I mean, you're just a young kid. What are you doing here? You ought to be out in a convertible, bird dogging chicks and banging beaver. What are you doing here, for Christ's sake? What's so funny about that? Well, Jesus, I mean, you guys do nothing but complain about how you can't stand it in this place here, and then you haven't got the guts just to walk out? I mean, what do you think you are, for Christ's sake? Crazy or something? Well, you're not. You're not. You're no crazier than the average asshole out walking around on the streets.
Warren Beatty was another anti-hero who made his own rules. On screen, his appeal consisted mainly of an improbably handsome face and a touching conviction that if he spent a long time searching for a word, it added up to drama.
It'll do any good. I just, you know, I have... You really want to know?
Yes.
There were a couple of... I mean, there were... Jesus, there were... This...
But off-screen, he built a reputation rivaling Errol Flynn's as he spent a long time searching for the ideal woman, the one who wouldn't mind about all the other women. No star talked less, and no star was more talked about. It was uncannily good career management. Clint Eastwood was an industry all by himself. In the late 60s, he starred in a string of westerns, playing a mysterious bounty hunter who said virtually nothing while the music did all the talking. In the cynical 70s, Eastwood shifted his main marketing emphasis to an alternative line of product, featuring himself as a cop fighting a lone battle against crime, his own police department, and the strange reluctance of soft-bellied liberals to put the bad guys away for good. His co-star was the biggest gun not mounted on a battleship.
I know what you're thinking, punk. You're thinking, did he fire 6 shots or only 5? Now, to tell you the truth, I forgot myself in all this excitement. But being this is a .44 Magnum, the most powerful handgun in the world, and will blow your head clean off, you've got to ask yourself the question, do I feel lucky? Well, do you, punk?
Robert De Niro had even more guns than Clint Eastwood. In Taxi Driver, De Niro was a one-man arsenal and as mad as a hatter. De Niro studied taxi driving and madness in order to play the role. He became Hollywood's first choice of star to portray the psychosis, squalor, and generally irredeemable sleaze of life in America. The new superstars of the big screen could play any role they wanted. They wanted to play criminals, psychopaths, misfits, vigilantes. The small screen was wide open for the maverick crime fighter. The maverick crime fighter worked outside the system. Raymond Burr starred as Ironside, a crippled president like FDR with the mind of Sherlock Holmes. The only downside of being Ironside was that the popular press called him Ironside far more often than they called him Raymond Burr. William Conrad was Cannon, another maverick crime fighter with a physical problem, an acute hamburger dependency. William Conrad's personal handicap was that the press couldn't remember his real name. They always called him Cannon. Peter Falk was Columbo, a maverick crime fighter in a crumpled raincoat. Columbo was famous all over the world. Peter Falk was offered movie parts by foreign film directors, but he usually had to wear a crumpled raincoat, and the foreign press called him Columbo. The most normal looking of the maverick crime fighters was James Garner in the Rockford Files. His movie career had been interesting but chancy. As Rockford, he was working all the time. Garner was Rockford, Rockford took Garner over, and Garner was never quite as famous as Rockford again. International television fame was a kind of half fame, like the moon. The dark side was the actor's name. The bright side was the character's name. Kojak was a maverick crime fighter played by Telly Savalas. Savalas was a prominent name in the feature list of some big movies, but Kojak was a big television name all over the world. The newspapers always called Savalas Kojak, even when he sued them.
Hello to everybody. Hello to everyone. Now
American television software was taking over the global market like Japanese television hardware, and the star got world famous along with it. If the star was a whole family, the whole family got famous.
we're the Osmond Brothers Quartet. We love to sing, you bet. So hello to everyone. Hi there!
Clean, pure, and disgustingly wholesome, the Osmond family was the most effective weapon of cultural aggression America had developed since flavored chewing gum.
Girl, when you hold me, how you control me, you bend and you fold me, any way you please.
There was someone in the Osmond family for everyone to love. Teenage girls loved Donnie, whose teeth were so dazzling and so numerous that it was difficult to count them. Teenage boys loved Marie, despite a Julie Andrews-type wholesomeness factor which set limits to illicit lust.
I realize the way your eyes kiss
It was an open question who loved little Jimmy. But since older members of the family, as they died off, could presumably always be replaced from an apparently infinite supply of younger ones, there seemed no reason why the Osmonds should not go on forever. For older entertainers in search of a version of eternal life that had 24-hour room service, Las Vegas turned into a place where they could grow old profitably. A kind of elephant's graveyard where they sold their own ivory before crashing to their knees for the last time.
Don't you know I'm caught in a trap? I can't walk out because I love you too much, man.
F. Scott Fitzgerald had once famously said that there were no second acts in American lives. Elvis Presley proved that his life did have a second act, and it had everything the first one had ever had, plus something more: flared pants. He himself was the first and best Elvis lookalike, a cabaret star lovingly recreating past glories for an audience of ecstatic ex-teenagers bussed in from out of state.
If we just close our eyes and dance around the floor.
Time was passing for Liberace too, but he put a brave face on it. The face was surgically renewable every 6 months, and he didn't mind looking like a caricature of himself because he always had. Las Vegas glitz had always been his thing, and in his lucrative dotage, he took it over the top in a kind of kitsch crusade. To the millions of blue-rinsed mothers who had always loved him, he was beginning to look like one of them. To observers out there in civilization, the American celebrity register had begun to look like a hologram show in Disney World. Frank Sinatra, followed closely by a truck full of assorted hairpieces, started an alarming cycle of saying goodbye and then returning.
I would sacrifice anything, come what might, for the sake of having you near, in spite of that warning voice. It comes in the night and it repeats and screams in my ear. Don't you know you...
His first return happened before anyone realized he'd been away. It was announced with the slogan, "All Blue Eyes is back." No one had ever called him Old Blue Eyes. The slogan was thought up by an ad man.
Just the thought of you makes me stop just before I begin. 'Cause I've got you under my skin.
The way the press swallowed the Old Blue Eyes brainwave for worldwide regurgitation tipped off everyone in the celebrity business that there was now so much media attention available, no story could fail. Sinatra had attained such monumental stature that even Princess Grace looked more regal instead of less when she appeared with him in public.
How many of us in the audience have a favorite Sinatra number? And how many of them are different? Well, that's Sinatra the artist, but I'd like to tell you a little bit about Sinatra the man, generous and warm-hearted.
Even Orson Welles gained weight in Sinatra's presence. Welles still dreamed of making movies, and from time to time actually did so, but what he mainly did was make commercials.
Blazing heat brings forth fruitfulness.
Trading on his fame as a genius, he recommended upmarket goods for financial reward. It paid the hotel bills.
Nature's very wonderful.
Finally, he was not even a body, just a voice.
In that short time, however, Carlsberg had already earned an international reputation. Times have changed, of course. In Victorian England, for example, there weren't many lagers around, so Carlsberg had no real competition.
The fame he had earned as a boy genius had lasted him a lifetime.
Probably the best lager in the world.
The Spanish painter Salvador Dali showed up in a commercial for chocolates. A shameless lifetime of chasing notoriety had finally paid off. For the billionaire eccentric Howard Hughes, the international fame country of 24-hour room service, including life support, was the last refuge. In a guarded hotel suite, doing nothing except grow his hair and fingernails until they threatened to fill the bedroom, he sought oblivion. While he did his best to die in secret, media memories flew out of the past. The world's TV screens were full of the daring flights that Hughes had once flown.
Had gathered to welcome Howard Hughes, his two navigators, radio engineer and flight engineer. The round-the-world flight had been completed in 3 days, 19 hours, 14 minutes, and 10 seconds.
A generation that had never seen it watched the Spruce Goose, the giant wooden flying boat that Hughes had personally designed, fly 100 yards before he set it down again and forgot it. They saw the startling results of the brassiere, which Hughes had personally designed to lift Jane Russell's bosom into the firing position. They saw Hughes in close pursuit of various beautiful women. They saw Hughes telling Washington committees why his enormous projects needed public money as well as his own.
I put the sweat of my life into this thing. I have my reputation rolled up in it. And I have stated several times that if it's a failure, I'll probably leave this country and never come back, and I mean it.
The media remembered everything about Howard Hughes, but still couldn't figure out that the real reason why he had run and hidden was because he remembered them.
Who was that fellow up there in your presidential suite?
We don't tell anything about that information. Howard Hughes is out here.
That isn't Howard Hughes.
No.
Hughes, as rich as any monarch and with more freedom of action, had chosen not to live with his fame. It raised the question of whether those other old men would go on riding the bandwagon if they knew how to get off. The disaster movie was a typical post-Watergate exercise in absolute cynicism. Its appeal depended on a plentiful supply of famous names to get killed off by the disaster. In towering Inferno, a skyscraper was set alight by corrupt wiring installed by unscrupulous big business, and 2 generations of film stars faced death from special effects. The Man from U.N.C.L.E. and Dr. Kildare both tried to escape, but they were doomed from the moment they signed the contract. The disaster movie was the exact expression of what fame had become, the survival of the fittest. A star had to be bankable to make it through to the last reel.
I don't know. Maybe they just ought to leave it the way it is. Kind of shrine to all the bullshit in the world.
At the end of the movie, Faye Dunaway, Paul Newman, and Steve McQueen were still alive because they had the most clout at the box office.
You know, we were lucky tonight. Body count's less than 200. You know, one of these days, you're gonna kill 10,000 in one of these fire traps. And I'm gonna keep eating smoke and bringing out bodies until somebody asks us how to build them.
Pele. Go! Oh, yes, Pele!
Out of the third world came the kind of hero America was no longer supplying. Honest, modest, good-looking, supernaturally skillful, the Brazilian footballer Pele personified soccer for all the countries in the world that played the game.
Very canny stuff. Rivellino, and it's Pele! He's got it! Pele has scored! And that is Brazil's 100th goal in the World Cup.
The game was played in practically every country except America, and even America got the point about Pele.
I kick it a long way, but you show me how to do it again.
Despite the predictable results of his one-man match against President Ford, for a while soccer looked like becoming a boom sport there, just because Pele was playing it. They didn't have anyone like him, so they bought him.
Maybe I could do it better with my head than my foot.
Even more unknown than the third world, Sweden produced Bjorn Borg.
So
40 love.
3 championship points for Borg, making 4 in all. That's it!
Sweden had been heard of because Greta Garbo and Ingrid Bergman had both left it. Some intellectuals had heard of it because the film director Ingmar Bergman had stayed there. But television had made tennis a world event, so Borg put Sweden on the map at last. Wise voices said what a relief it was to watch a young man hit the top and stay there without being distracted by fame. You could tell by his tightly controlled headband that he just wasn't the sort of dumb cluck who would open a boutique, get married in a pink tracksuit, OD on sleeping pills and go broke. The American woman champion Billie Jean King occasionally shouted at herself, but never at anyone else. She had discipline. The other American woman champion, Chris Evert, never shouted even at herself. She was so disciplined, she was practically Borg-like. The American male champion, Jimmy Connors, on the other hand, behaved badly when things went against him.
Well, you stand up and do something about it. About what? Anything you want. Anything you want.
And the supreme American male champion, John McEnroe, behaved badly all the time.
You can't be serious, man. You cannot be serious! That ball was on the line. Chalk flew up. It was clearly in. He's walking over. Everyone knows it's in this whole stadium, and you call it out? Explain that to me, will you?
Tennis was the right-shaped sport for television, so the whole world could tune in to what was essentially a display of character. Famous tennis players became measures of temperament in every household. Children were told, don't be like McEnroe, be like Borg.
Money, 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 must be funny in the rich man's world.
Another Swedish world hit was ABBA, a pop quartet who turned themselves into Sweden's second biggest export money earner after Volvo. 4 people with unpronounceable names were doing what the Beatles once did. Churn out hit singles you couldn't help singing along with while you danced to them, and vice versa.
It's a rich man's world.
ABBA didn't sing their songs in Swedish, but on the other hand, their English didn't sound American.
My mind, ain't he sad? And if he happens to be free, I bet he wouldn't fancy me. That's too bad.
It was a new style of Euro-English, the first sign that a united Europe might rival America as a cultural power.
And win a fortune in a game, my life will never be the same.
The 4 faces of ABBA were famous everywhere in the world, even though the number of people who could pronounce the name Agnetha Faltskog never increased beyond her immediate family. Even more outlandish than Sweden was Hong Kong, whence arose the significant figure of Bruce Lee, kickboxing star of the Kung Fu movies that swept first the cinemas of the Far East, then the Chinatowns of all the world's big cities, and finally everywhere that powerless people dreamed of paralyzing their oppressors with a sudden outburst of uncanny martial arts.
Hey, look at that.
Bruce revolutionized his chosen art form. With him as the star, the Kung Fu movie was no longer just a lot of actors kicking each other. It was a lot of actors kicking each other with one actor looking philosophical. In a world that had come to be ruled by fear, Bruce Lee dared to dream. He died young, but his fame went on growing. Not even the dubbing studio could dim Bruce's message.
Now, you get out of here. I'm warning you. You bastards can't push us around.
Bowie. He represents it all to me. Excitement, space. See, I'm just the space cadet. He's the commander.
I like people who are AC/DC. You know what I mean?
Parents in the 60s had been worried that their children would have their minds bent by drugs. Parents in the 70s, some of whom had been the children of the 60s, were worried that their children would have their genders bent by Bowie. Bisexuality was just sex twice, and nothing could be safer than sex. But there was no escaping the awkward fact that the dubious heroes of popular culture were aiming their stuff at the young. For anyone not so young, all the heroes were from another time. Duke Ellington had survived into relaxed old age in a mellow tone.
And if you would like to be respectably cool, then tilt the left earlobe on the beat and snap the finger on the after beat there.
He was a reminder of a past that had been well-mannered, smoothly rhythmic, unraucous.
And so by routining one's finger snapping and choreographing one's earlobe tilting, one discovers that one can become as cool as one wishes to be. With that, we certainly want to thank you for the wonderful way you've inspired us and remind you that you are very beautiful, very sweet, very gracious.
There were past heroes to be proud of, but what about the present? The young didn't want to wait. The world was theirs, and they wanted their immortality now. The first terrorists to make it as media stars were the Germans Andreas Baader and Ulrike Meinhof. They killed innocent people deemed by them to be guilty of compliance with the ruthless capitalist system. They were famously hard to catch. After they did get caught, they had no one left to kill except themselves. Ulrike did it first and got famous all over again. Terror was a path to glory. In America, Patty Hearst was known only as the granddaughter of William Randolph Hearst, the man whose mass circulation newspapers had given 20th century fame its initial boost. Kidnapped by a tiny group of homegrown terrorists calling themselves the Symbionese Liberation Army, she showed up alongside them, pulling a bank raid. Some said she had been brainwashed. Others said that she had simply found running around with guns and getting famous for it more fun than being anonymously rich. Either way, she was rescued and led back to the enormous wealth which could buy protection against fame gone wrong. As thousands of cops closed in on the three-man Liberation Army, the veneer of civilization looked awfully thin. A few head cases could stage their own revolution and grab world headlines. The wrong people were getting famous. In Uganda, Idi Amin had been just a sergeant when the British were still running the country. Now he was the man in charge and running the country into the ground, killing thousands while doing so. He was a headhunter, but the world couldn't see that, even though some of the heads were in his refrigerator. What the world saw was a brilliantly successful entertainer. Idi presented himself as a political genius equipped to solve the world's problems. When Britain went on a 3-day week, Idi announced a Save Britain campaign in his self-proclaimed capacity as King of Scotland. When terrorists hijacked a plane full of Israelis and landed in Entebbe, Idi detained the hostages to please his allies among the Arab nations. Israel raided Entebbe to get their people out, and Idi was famous all over again. He was never out of the headlines. When the Entebbe movies came out, his face was up there on the posters. The civilized world was uneasily aware that there wasn't a lot it could do except wait for his embarrassed neighbors to chase him away. He ended up in the Sands Hotel, Jeddah, giving interviews about his readiness to return to his grieving country. It was another stand-up routine. The Sands, Jeddah, was Idi's Las Vegas. Even in its own eyes, America was a wimp in a world gone wild. The feeling of powerlessness was powerfully embodied by Woody Allen.
Everybody is just ecstatic that you're here this weekend. The turnout is tremendous. And
He was an anti-hero hero, devoid of strength, his only dominance over words, an intellectual who understood everything but couldn't change it, a nebbish.
What are future generations going to say about us? My God, someday we're gonna be like him. I mean, and he was probably one of the beautiful people. He was probably dancing and playing tennis and everything. And now look, this is what happens to us. It's very important to have some kind of personal integrity. I'll be hanging in a classroom one day, and I want to make sure when I thin out that I'm well thought of.
In real life, Woody Allen was a superstar whose surefire art house appeal enabled him to use Hollywood as a means of artistic expression without letting Hollywood use him for anything. Instead of attending the Oscar ceremony, he stayed in New York playing jazz. He had long-term relationships with movie stars, and if the affair failed, he made a successful movie about it.
I have to face facts. I adore Albie, but our relationship doesn't seem to work anymore.
I'll have the usual trouble with Annie in bed tonight. What do I need this?
If only I had the nerve to break up, but it would really hurt him.
If only I didn't feel guilty asking Annie to move out. It'd probably wreck her. But I should be honest.
Albie, let's face it, you know, I don't think our relationship is working.
I know. A relationship, I think, is like a shark. You know, it has to constantly move forward or it dies. And I think what we got on our hands is a dead shark.
For everyone in the business, he was the model of how fame could be managed. For everyone outside the business, he was the most famous example of what America had become. Nervous.
Hello, Benjamin.
Hello, Mrs. Robinson.
Dustin Hoffman became famous in the 60s as The Graduate, a nervous young man who suspected that life in America was stacked against him.
Well.
What time do you have to be in school?
8:30.
We gotta get this show on the road because I gotta shower and shave and shampoo my hair.
He became more famous still as an even more nervous, slightly less young man in the 70s in Kramer versus Kramer.
Now, where's Bonnie keep the,
In the stove.
pan? The stove. Okay.
This time he knew that life in America was stacked against him.
No, you're not doing it right. Come here, you're not doing it right. Look, you gotta do it fast, see? It's the wrist. So the gucky part gets dissolved. Then you take the bread and
He was small, put upon, and worried, like Woody Allen minus the wisecracks.
Fold the French toast.
I think you forgot the milk.
I didn't. Milk comes last. You always gotta put the milk in last. When you're having a good time, you forget the most important thing, right?
The only American who looked and sounded as if he was still on top of it all was Muhammad Ali.
I just try to stay halfway decent looking. Boxing's a rough sport. And you get hit a lot. And right after the fights, I run right to the dressing room, run right to the mirror, and I check to make sure I'm still, you know, presentable. It's a rough sport being pounded on all the time. A lot of people's features change. Mainly when I fight them.
Though he was no longer as fast on his feet as he used to be, this was the period of his greatest fame. The worldwide satellite-linked television network meant that he could fight in exotic places like Zaire or Manila and be watched by everyone. If the fight itself proved dull, or even if he lost it, he was still faster with his mouth than any other boxer.
So I never worry about hitting power. So a man like George that comes out with those big... That's why he throw him, he draws them back. Watch out, he come to the left.
Ali had himself and the world convinced that for him, the usual laws didn't apply. He was going to keep his brain in his head and his money in the bank. Fame was a storm, and he knew how to ride it. He could manage. Barbra Streisand was a new kind of American world heavyweight champion. She was the first female movie star who started out at the top. The studios didn't audition her, she auditioned them. She was so powerful, she could play it as she pleased. Her albums sold in millions. She could open any Broadway show she felt like. Her television specials reached the world. She didn't need Hollywood, and Hollywood had always been impressed by that. It handed her the moon. If she'd wanted to remake Towering Inferno as a musical, they would have let her. Feminists were a rising force, and they admired Streisand for being herself, for not trying to get her funny looks fixed, for putting all those male chauvinist Hollywood moguls in their place. She could manage. Elvis Presley looked as if he could manage right up to the last moment. But the moment came early. His premature death was the first hint the world had that the ageless demigod who had always seemed to be bursting with confidence had never found fame easy after all. Now, with his troubled physical presence finally out of the way, his image was free from interference and fit to be born again. His southern mansion, Graceland, was instantly promoted to the same status as the Holy Sepulchre, with the difference that this time there was no argument about the exact location of the sacred place. The field was free for Elvis Presley lookalikes to emerge, who with the aid of plastic surgery at least looked more like his image than he ended up doing. His career was easier to manage without him. Elvis made more money in the 3 years after his death than he had done the whole time he was alive. The arrival of the home video meant that the Elvis of your memories would rise out of a box at the touch of a button, resurrected into another eternal fame, a shining spirit. America had shown the world that a famous person's fame could take over from the person and lead a separate life even after death. It was too good an idea for show business to monopolize. The advantages for politics were too obvious. Along the winding trail from the past ambled a man who knew how fame worked, who knew how it could work for him, who had lived his life under hot lights and could speak dialogue because he had never spoken anything else. The trail led all the way to the White House.
I'm gonna do it just one more time. You ain't seen nothing yet.
Clive James' fame in the 20th century will conclude in a moment.
This is politics, Joe, the game of being alive. And you think you're what? Above that? Above alive is what? Dead!
The wine-dark kiss of the angel of death. I'm a legionnaire.
Join us in the wings as the most talked-about play in years gets ready for New York.
I started out to write a play about being a gay man in the United States in the mid-'80s.
Angels in America on Broadway, a documentary on great performances.
Watch Great Performances tomorrow night.
From the smallest molecule to the vastness of space, from the beauty of burning deserts to barren lands of ice, from the edge of exploration to the drama of survival. Everything and every place, on Earth and beyond, is within your reach on public television.
Is this your idea of a summer concert on public television? Well, lighten up, because this summer the biggest names in country and rock take center stage. Michael Bolton, K.D. Lang, Keith Richards, Neil Young, Gloria Estefan, Aaron Neville, and more. So kick back for music so real, so hot, so cool, you'll feel like you're there. Lighten up. It's summer on public television.
Center Stage premieres Monday. Don't miss it.
This summer, it's your chance to travel light and go on tour with these two. Not, you say? Well, lighten up. There may be something you missed on your last trip around the world, like Sicily's Godfather of Gelato or Melbourne's sewers. Rough Guide is your passport to other worldly things. It's travel with an edge, adventure with an attitude. Lighten up your summer on public TV with Rough Guide.
Watch the premiere of Rough Guide.
KPBS San Diego.